Okay, folks, I guess we ought to get started. I want to thank you all for being with us today. This program is about incident reporting and investigations, and particularly reporting incidents related to abuse and neglect at the agencies and programs you work at. Let me just take a minute and sort of reflect a bit as to how we got here, really, in terms of why this decade, this time, this place. You know, things have changed in caregiving over the past couple decades, in the last 20 years. Just think for a minute. 20 years ago, for example, most people who were disabled in any significant way spent most of their lives in very large public institutions. They were hidden away from view. No one ever saw them. Very different today. In the last 20 years, that's changed. Most do not spend their lives in large public institutions. And in fact, most people spend their lives in programs and residences very similar to the kinds of community programs you represent. A second thing that has occurred in the last 20 years is what we do for people, no matter where they are, whether it's a large institution or in your programs. What we do is very different. 20 years ago, it was okay for people to sit around and do nothing for days on end. In some of the largest institutions, basically what happened is we just simply warehoused people. Individuals never had an opportunity, for example, to become better at what they could do. No one knew what they could do. No one tried to help anyone, and individuals simply didn't exercise a whole lot of personal freedom. Today, that's very different. The kinds of agencies you represent an attempt to get people into the community, get people involved with the community, become citizens like everyone else in this country. And there's a third important change. This is really critical, and I guess it's why we're here. How we treat people, no matter where they live, no matter where they work, that has changed. 20, 30 years ago, it was okay to raise your voice. That was okay. I've had people tell me 20, 30 years ago they could give a child in a children's psychiatric center a therapeutic slap. That was okay. There are all sorts of things. It used to be okay, for example, to lock people in their room if they were giving you a hard time. That was okay. Those things have changed. Our expectations about how we treat people who are working and living and involved with your programs, the people you serve, have changed considerably. That's what this program's about. It's about how we identify inappropriate behaviors in particular, how we report them, and what we do with them once they've been reported. That's what this program will address. Let me talk a minute about mission and the mission of your agencies and programs. It's really important because none of what we're going to talk about is going to make very much sense unless we tie it to the objectives you're trying to achieve every day. Every caregiving institution in this country, I think, shares a common formulation of mission. Even though many of your programs are different, all of them are there to provide appropriate services, however you define what's appropriate for your program, in a caring and hospitable environment. An environment which protects people from harm. Now, that's really important to understand. I'm not a clinician, so I can't talk to you anything about what the appropriate services are. I don't know whether this diagnosis requires this therapy. I just don't know. But I'll tell you this. I do know that if you're getting the right medicine, but you're going back to a residence that causes you fear, that in fact can harm you unnecessarily, there's a problem. And we need to correct that wherever possible. So we need to understand that to create that caring and hospitable environment is half of the mission that you're there to provide. Now let me just illustrate this here in the flip chart. I've got here in the flip chart a line. See this line across here? That line represents all the range of behavior you might observe at work every day. On the left-hand side, we identified the excellent behaviors, the best behaviors. On the right-hand side, not quite as scientific a term, putrid behaviors, okay? Those are the worst. And we also know there's a little dotted line down here that represents where we change over from behaviors that are okay to those that are not okay. So basically, if you're over on the left-hand side, you're doing it right, but if you're the farther to the left, that's even better. If you cross over, there are a lot of things that aren't okay. Some are really bad. Abuse and neglect represents that kind of behavior that is bad. In essence, we've said it's not just you made a mistake, it's not just that somebody wasn't careful enough. It is that somebody did it so wrong that we think it has to be classified differently than simply something that's not okay. Obviously, in any institution, any organization, any program, The fewer of the not okay behaviors, the better. And our job is to find ways to reduce the situations that would result in harm. That is, the behaviors that fall on the right-hand side of that particular line. Now let me say one other thing, and it's sort of illustrated up here. Abuse and neglect is what this course is about, but I want to stress that merely avoiding abuse and neglect doesn't fulfill your mission. Doesn't mean you have appropriate services. And I might add one other thing. Does it necessarily mean that you have a caring and hospitable environment? Think about it. Let's go back to the line here for a moment. You avoid this, there still are a whole range of things here which could be improved, which could be made better. So let's not suppose for the moment that merely avoiding the worst fulfills a mission, but nonetheless, this is where we're going to start, because these are the issues which are going to get the quickest, the most attention, the most intense attention you'll see before we're done today, should be from you and from others that you work with. We talked a bit about the reporting issues, and or at the very least the mission, excuse me, and we talked about behaviors that aren't okay, and we talk a little now about just what we mean by abuse, because it's easy to use that word. We want to be careful when we use it. First of all, most organizations that outlaw abuse are talking not only about putrid behaviors, but what's a characteristic of that putrid behavior is usually maliciousness, where somebody really went out looking to cause somebody harm. I should tell you, that's usually an element of any definition of abuse. But I should tell you, you don't have to go out looking to hurt somebody to probably be responsible under these statutes for abuse. You could be just reckless or careless. Sometimes people just don't think. They're reckless or careless. And I'm going to tell you something. It's okay for you and I to be reckless and careless with ourselves. For example, we may eat the wrong foods constantly and know that it could have a disastrous effect on our lives. Some people smoke and so forth. The reality is, however, we can be reckless and careless with ourselves. But when we're interacting with other people, particularly in a caregiving situation, we're held to a higher degree of responsibility. So what we have to do, I think, in these situations is avoid the kinds of behaviors that would essentially be expressions of carelessness. Not just making a mistake, folks. People make mistakes all the time. But I'm talking about carelessness and recklessness where we could have foreseen the consequences of our behavior towards somebody else and, in fact, results in their harm or potentially results in their harm, could result in their harm. At least those aspects of maliciousness and recklessness and carelessness, I think, are ordinarily associated with the question of abuse. It also ordinarily involves some kind of significant harm that's resulted to the person you're serving, or at least the potential for significant harm. For example, if you swing your hand, try to hit somebody, but miss, probably a defense isn't that, well, I didn't really hit him. The potential was there for significant harm, and that is a kind of behavior, I think, that would certainly be subject to concern. We're going to talk a bit about the reporting responsibility, really important issue. It's not good enough just to avoid abusing the people you're serving. Not good enough just to avoid neglecting them. If you observe a behavior which you would categorize as abuse or neglect, it's your affirmative responsibility to report it using the procedures that your agency has developed for that purpose. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front, that ain't easy. It is not easy to do. For a lot of reasons. Most people in this group have grown up hearing that it's wrong to be a tattletale. How many times do you hear that when you're a kid? My mother used to say to me, Antone, nobody likes a tattletale. Well, I'll tell you something. We've even said that to our children. And probably most of us sort of believe it. But we do expect you to tattle when it comes to issues of abuse and neglect. We do. Let's not even call it, it's reporting, but it's really tattling. But we need it. Let's think about why we need it, because the people you're serving often can't report for themselves. And if we're there to protect them from harm, to create a caring and hospitable environment, part of that, not the entire thing, but part of it, is identifying those situations which are causing people harm. There are other reasons why it's hard to report. The people we're working with are often our friends. It's not unlikely that'll happen. And we're asked then to file a report that could get them into trouble. That's difficult to do. And then some of the things we see occurring are things which we may even do at home. You know, interesting thing, the standard of care is higher at this location than it would be in your own home. And so you look at it and you say, well, that's what I do to my kid. Or that's how I would talk to my wife or my husband. You know something? Not good enough here, and yet it's hard to make a report when you know you don't even necessarily agree with the standards, but here the standards are different. And you know something else? Sometimes it just isn't clear. Sometimes you're just not sure. Let's try a little exercise here, and I'm going to ask Lynn, if you'd help me, Lynn. Lynn, let's just suppose that Lynn is somebody in one of the programs who has had a behavior problem over the years and hasn't had very good table manners. And let's suppose I'm at lunch with Lynn, and you folks are all at lunch too. So you're going to observe what we're talking about here. You're going to observe. You're going to have a choice here about whether to report or not to report. So Lynn, here's the situation. Lynn is eating and she has some mashed potatoes in her plate, and while she's eating with her mashed potatoes, she picks them up and rubs them in her face. And I say, Lynn, wait, Lynn, come on, no, you're supposed to eat with your fork. You've been doing really good. Come on, Lynn, and I get her cleaned up. And so Lynn picks up the mashed potatoes again, rubs them, starts eating with her hands again, rubs them in her face. Up, very good. Now I say, Lynn, now come on, please, Lynn. No, that's enough, Lynn. Please, don't do that now. And I clean it. Come on, use your fork, Lynn. You've done really well the past couple. Use your fork. She picks up the mashed potatoes one last time, and this time she throws them all over me. And I say, Lynn, I told you to use your fork. Now use your fork, Lynn, and do it right. Now, I'd like you all just for a minute to think about what you just observed. Is that abuse?